The crystal chandelier above the ballroom shimmered, catching the frantic, silent tears Eleanor Vance refused to shed. Her jaw ached from the effort of maintaining the patrician smile she'd perfected over 60 years of high society living. This was supposed to be the culmination of her life's work, the perfect wedding for her only daughter, Charlotte. Instead, it was an execution. The public humiliation, delivered 3 minutes ago during the toast, had been swift, surgical, and absolute. Charlotte, radiating cruel confidence in her custom silk gown, didn't just thank her absent father. She used the microphone to detail, for 300 guests of the Pacific Northwest's elite, the fragile, performative tyranny of her mother's social climbing, ending with a chilling declaration, "The only thing I inherited from Eleanor Vance is her trust fund, and thank God that is liquid." The immediate choice facing Eleanor was whether to shatter the perfect glass facade she had built, the facade that was her daughter's entire world, or swallow the poison and preserve the family name, damning herself to a life of hollow silence. Eleanor was not a woman built for silent suffering. Her entire life was governed by the fatal flaw of unyielding pride. She saw compromise as corruption and disrespect as a declaration of war. That pride, that internal rigidity, now demanded action. She watched Charlotte laughing across the room, the sound sharp and unforgiving. Eleanor knew what she had to do, but the execution had to be flawless, final, and occur before the initial shockwave subsided. She had 72 hours. The time it took for the local papers to print their Sunday edition, and for the last of the distant guests to check out of the Peninsula Club. The clock was already ticking. Eleanor Vance's hand, encased in a pearl-white glove, settled on the shoulder of Michelle, the catering manager. Her voice, though barely a whisper, carried the chilling authority of a judge passing sentence. She instructed him to cover for her abrupt exit, a fabricated migraine that was somehow more socially palatable than a public breakdown. This measured departure, rather than a frantic escape, was the first manifestation of her unyielding pride. She would not grant them the spectacle of her brokenness. She navigated the sea of silk and tailored wool, the air heavy with the cloying, expensive scent of lilies and stale, spilled champagne. Her movements were stiff, precise, like an antique doll whose joints had rusted solid but whose mechanism still forced a grim, forward motion. She heard the high, resuming chatter and forced laughter. Behind her, a sound like a swarm of insects settling back onto their feast after a momentary disturbance. Her focus narrowed immediately onto the logistical parameters of vengeance. Grief was a messy emotion she would schedule for later. For now, she only recognized the necessity of restoring order, a mandate demanded by her excessive pride. Charlotte had used the veneer of familial love to inflict maximum damage on Eleanor's most prized possession, her reputation. That wound could only be closed by an equal, asymmetrical attack delivered with the same public flourish. The world has a strange way of twisting the ties that should bind us most tightly. If someone you raised betrayed you so thoroughly, would you prioritize blood or justice? It's a question few of us truly want to answer. She felt the roughness of the burgundy velvet rope pressed against her palm as she stepped through the discreet service exit, a slight shudder running through her as she transitioned from the blinding light of the ballroom to the cool, concrete reality of the parking bay. She waved off her driver. This tactical mission required anonymity. Driving herself home, an act she hadn't performed in years, felt appropriate for shedding the persona Charlotte had just publicly attempted to murder. She checked the dashboard clock. The engagement party for the rival family's son was tomorrow night. She had less than 70 hours. To make sure that the Vances were the only subject of conversation, and that the punchline was no longer on her. The immediate, minor problem caused by her pride was not the internal pain, but the fact that she had wasted precious time maintaining a pointless facade in front of the servants. That time could have been spent calculating. Her first task, locate the asset Charlotte believed was untouchable. Eleanor reached the sprawling estate overlooking the Puget Sound. The house, all glass and stone, was a monument to the legacy she had painstakingly constructed, a legacy Charlotte believed she had just inherited. The massive oak front door opened silently, swallowing her into the oppressive silence of the foyer. The clean, sharp scent of ozone from the nearby water mixed with the faint, lingering perfume of polished mahogany. Eleanor walked straight to the library, her shoes clicking on the marble floor like muffled gunshots. She ignored the staff, their presence a silent accusation that she had failed in the very thing she valued most: control. She went to the heavy steel safe hidden behind the first edition of Moby Dick. Her fingers, still trembling slightly despite her rigid control, punched the combination, a sequence of dates marking not family birthdays, but business triumphs. Inside lay the ledger detailing the Vance family trust. Charlotte's cruel dismissal of Eleanor's social climbing was predicated on the belief that her mother was merely the custodian of the Vance wealth, not its architect. This was a crucial misunderstanding, a structural error in her daughter's betrayal. The trust was indeed liquid, as Charlotte had crowed. But Charlotte, blinded by her own resentment and the convenient narrative of the oppressive mother, had never bothered to read the fine print Eleanor had mandated a decade earlier, when the first signs of her daughter's entitled coldness had begun to show. Eleanor pulled out the thick document, the cool, crisp vellum, a comforting texture against her skin. The language was precise, legal, and merciless. It's easy to dismiss details until they become the very mechanism of your downfall. How many times have you signed something without reading the fine print, trusting the person on the other side? Sometimes that trust is the most expensive thing you own. Her eyes scanned the fourth clause, revocation of beneficiary rights upon public disparagement. Charlotte, in her moment of triumph and sheer arrogance, had triggered the legal equivalent of a landmine. Her portion of the trust, the portion she had bragged about inheriting, was now irrevocably subject to Eleanor's absolute discretion. The clock showed 68 hours and 15 minutes, remaining until the papers hit the stands. Eleanor had the leverage, but she needed to refine the method. She needed a way to use this financial truth to restore her reputation and inflict a cost that matched the depth of her daughter's insult. She pulled her phone from her pocket and called Douglas, her lawyer, his office hours be damned. Her pride demanded the total destruction of Charlotte's perceived safety net. Obstaculo 1, Desafio Pratico, 25% to Historia. Douglas, a man whose career was built entirely on managing the complexities and excesses of the Vance family, answered on the second ring, his voice thick with sleep and alarm. Eleanor skipped the pleasantries. Douglas, Clause 4 of the trust, activated. I need the papers drafted, certified, and filed electronically before 9 a.m. tomorrow. No exceptions. I need a public declaration of the revocation, carefully worded, detailing the breach of fiduciary conduct. Focus on the word disparagement and the concept of material damage to the family entity. Douglas sputtered, the sound tinny through the speaker. Eleanor, that's explosive. Are you certain? Charlotte will fight this. You'll destroy any chance of reconciliation. The legal fees alone will be astronomical. And the media. Eleanor cut him off, her voice dropping to an icy register. The reconciliation was destroyed the moment she slandered me in front of 300 people. The cost is irrelevant. My reputation is the asset she sought to liquidate. My objective is to prove that I am the cornerstone, not a footnote. My pride demands this precision, Douglas. She targeted the family name. I target her financial future. 65 hours remain. Do not fail me. She hung up, a grim sense of satisfaction replacing the gnawing emptiness in her stomach. It's tempting to believe that revenge is a sudden, furious burst of action, but true retribution requires meticulous planning, an almost cold-blooded detachment. Do you agree that the coldest plans are always the most effective? The practical challenge was twofold: ensuring the legal move was airtight and managing the societal fallout. Eleanor couldn't just revoke the trust. She had to control the narrative. If she simply appeared spiteful, the public sympathy would swing to Charlotte, cementing Eleanor's isolation. She needed a reason that transcended petty family drama, a reason that appealed to the strict business ethics of her social circle. She walked into the kitchen, the hum of the industrial refrigerator, a constant low drone. She opened the pantry, pulling out a bottle of rare single-malt scotch, the smooth glass bottle cool, in her hand. She poured a measure, not for comfort, but for clarity. Charlotte's fiancé, Robert Thorne, a quiet investment banker, was the weak link. He was marrying Charlotte for the perceived stability of the Vance name and wealth, not for love. If the wealth evaporated before the ink on the marriage license dried, Robert's loyalty would be tested. Eleanor needed to apply that pressure immediately. She finished her drink and checked the time again. 64 hours and 45 minutes. She walked up the sweeping staircase, her focus now shifting from the legal document to a diplomatic strategy. She needed a conduit, a person trusted by the social hierarchy, to plant the seed of doubt about Charlotte's newfound financial instability. And she knew exactly who: Cassandra Hayes, the society columnist, and Eleanor's lifelong rival. The enemy of my daughter is my friend. Subtramas e complexidades. The appointment with Cassandra Hayes was set for 9 a.m. sharp at the Morningstar Country Club, precisely when Douglas would file the legal documents. Eleanor dressed with the same immaculate care she applied to managing the family portfolio. A navy blue suit, sharp enough to cut glass, served as her armor. The subtle scent of expensive leather from her handbag mingled with the faint, residual smell of burnt tobacco from the night before, a comfort from her rarely touched stash. Cassandra, waiting at a secluded table overlooking the impeccably manicured 18th green, looked calculating and hungry. She had spent decades attempting to dethrone Eleanor as the pillar of society, and the smell of fresh scandal was clearly exhilarating. "Eleanor, darling, you look composed." "Considering," Cassandra purred, stirring her tea. Eleanor did not sit. She placed a small embossed card on the table. It was an invitation to the unveiling of the new Vance Foundation wing at the Children's Hospital, scheduled for the following week. "I need a favor, Cassandra, and you need a story that will sell papers." Charlotte's outburst was juvenile. It was the product of severe emotional distress stemming from an ongoing private matter concerning the Foundation's management. Cassandra leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. "Private matter? The trust is involved?" "The trust has provisions that mandate ethical conduct. Charlotte, in her distress, has made poor choices regarding the Foundation's outreach programs, choices that sadly force me to assume full fiduciary control immediately to prevent scandal. I have filed the papers this morning. It's a painful but necessary correction. A mother's duty, wouldn't you agree?" Eleanor's voice was laden with feigned grief and genuine superiority. She subtly repositioned herself as the victimized matriarch protecting the community, not the vengeful mother. There's an art to manipulating a narrative, not by telling a direct lie, but by carefully curating the truth you allow others to see. Have you ever had to twist an ugly situation into a beautiful lie just to survive? Cassandra smiled, a sharp, delighted expression. The story wasn't about a mother and daughter fight. It was about a noble society figure protecting vulnerable children from her daughter's recklessness. It gave Eleanor the high moral ground her pride desperately required. "And the wedding?" Cassandra asked, picking up the invitation. "The wedding stands for now, but Robert Thorne is a man of principle. I imagine he won't tolerate a wife whose erratic behavior puts a charity at risk. He's been shielded from the specifics until now. I'm simply asking you to report the factual legal change, the Foundation's consolidation under my sole control, and allow the society to draw its own conclusions about Charlotte's stability." Eleanor's glove brushed the table, feeling the smooth, cool ceramic of the teacup. She left Cassandra to chew on the bait. 61 hours and 10 minutes remaining. Now she had to wait for the first domino to fall. Robert. Obstáculo 2. Dilema moral. 50% da historia. Irreversão. The day crawled by. Eleanor spent the afternoon in her study, not working, but observing the silence of the house. The distant, rhythmic thud of waves against the sea wall was the only constant sound, a metronome counting down the hours. By 5 p.m., the initial tremors were hitting. Robert Thorne called, his voice tight with controlled panic. He didn't ask about Charlotte. He asked exclusively about the Foundation's restructuring and the immediate implications for Charlotte's liquidity. "Robert," Eleanor sighed, performing the weary mother routine perfectly. "It pains me to say it, but Charlotte's behavior has been erratic. The trust is complex. I had no choice but to take the necessary steps to protect the capital. She is currently unable to access those funds." Robert's reply was swift and transactional. "The wedding is in 2 days, Eleanor. We had plans predicated on her immediate access to that liquidity. Are you telling me she's essentially—" He didn't finish the thought, but the implication, penniless, hung heavy in the air. Eleanor now faced the true moral dilemma. Robert was not the target. Charlotte was. But humiliating her daughter meant not only bankrupting her reputation, but also financially crippling the life she was building with an innocent man. Robert might be calculating, but he had committed no offense against Eleanor. Her pride demanded maximum impact, but her fading maternal instinct presented a faint, unwelcome flicker of hesitation. Could she ruin not just her daughter, but the two families tethered by this doomed marriage? We all know the line between justice and cruelty is thin, especially when pride is the fuel. When your enemy is ready to fall, do you stop at their defeat, or do you obliterate everything they touched? The choice was settled when she saw the first snippets of Cassandra's column leaked online. The tone was devastating. The Vance matriarch steps in to shield children from daughter's erratic behavior. The public narrative was secured. Eleanor's position was restored, but the financial move was now irreversible. Reversion, 150%. Eleanor suddenly realized that Charlotte's outburst during the toast had not been purely malicious, but a desperate final cry for attention. Her research into the trust wasn't driven by greed, but by a twisted attempt to force Eleanor to truly see her. Charlotte had needed to provoke an extreme reaction because she believed the only way to get her mother's attention was to destroy what Eleanor loved most, her status. If Charlotte truly wanted the money, she would have kept quiet until after the nuptials. Charlotte hadn't just insulted her. She had burned down the house to escape the control inside. This revelation, though instantly dismissed by Eleanor's overwhelming pride, felt like a cold splash of salt water across her face. Eleanor stiffened, pushing the unsettling thought aside. It was too late. Her pride was now fully invested in the destruction she had wrought. Robert's next words confirmed the necessary severity of her path. "Eleanor, I'm calling off the wedding, effective immediately. I will issue a statement regarding unforeseen financial instability and breach of trust. I suggest Charlotte address her mother." Robert hung up, the line going dead with a sharp final click. 58 hours remain. The collapse had begun. Consequências da reversão. O tempo está acabando. The silence that followed Robert's termination of the engagement was heavy, a suffocating blanket woven with the threads of shattered dreams. Eleanor didn't immediately feel triumph. She felt the strange, hollow weight of inevitability. Charlotte's desperate maneuver for attention, now viewed through the lens of Reversion 1, only solidified Eleanor's rigid belief that her daughter was fundamentally broken and required extreme measures to be corrected, a perverse extension of her unyielding pride. The wedding, set for tomorrow, was off. The guests were already arriving in town, expecting the event of the season. Eleanor had only 157 hours and 30 minutes. Before the Sunday paper, carrying Cassandra's detailed column, and the devastating announcement of the annulment officially cemented the disaster. The challenge now was minimizing the fallout on Eleanor's name and ensuring Charlotte felt the full, necessary sting of her mistake. She contacted her personal assistant, instructing her to coordinate the immediate return of all gifts and send discreet, pre-written communications to the 300 guests, citing Robert's sudden, unexpected withdrawal due to professional crisis. The narrative had to remain tight. Robert failed Charlotte, not the other way around. This required speed and absolute control over information. Controlling a story in a small, tight-knit community is like trying to hold water in your hand. It's impossible. Gossip finds a way. But for the sake of public reputation, sometimes you have to pretend the narrative you feed them is the absolute truth. What story do you tell yourself to get through the hardest moments? Charlotte finally called, hours later. Her voice, usually sharp and condescending, was ragged, scraped raw by disbelief. "Mother, what did you do?" "Robert, he said the trust is gone. He canceled the wedding." "You did this, Charlotte," Eleanor stated, her voice steady and emotionless. She sat by the window watching the last sliver of sun dip below the horizon, bathing the room in a cold, gray light. The smell of the coastal air was turning sharp and metallic as the temperature dropped. "You publicly disparaged me, the primary benefactor, during your wedding toast. Clause 4 is explicit. You are currently suspended as beneficiary until you demonstrate stability and publicly retract your baseless accusations regarding the foundation. You are financially isolated." "Baseless? You literally just destroyed my life over your precious pride," Charlotte screamed into the phone, the sound grating against Eleanor's ear. "It is my structure, Charlotte. You tried to tear it down. Did you truly believe I would allow that act of cruelty to go unpunished?" Eleanor countered, refusing to acknowledge the truth of her daughter's desperation. Her pride demanded total victory, not a ceasefire. You have less than 57 hours to decide if you want to salvage anything or face the financial and social consequences of your actions. Eleanor hung up, her fingers digging deep into the soft, worn leather of the antique phone rest. She had thrown down the gauntlet. "Superação e crescimento, mas a falha ainda espreita." The hours leading up to Saturday morning were marked by a tense, psychological warfare. Charlotte, stripped of her fiancé and her fortune, had retreated to the guest house, her silence now more terrifying to Eleanor than her screams. Eleanor, meanwhile, was strategically addressing the community. She attended a small private charity brunch, appearing subdued and tragically resilient. She offered only carefully constructed snippets of conversation, emphasizing the heartbreak of a mother forced to choose integrity over sentiment. The strategy was working. The community, valuing stability and established wealth above all else, was swiftly rallying around the poor Eleanor, the victim of a spoiled, entitled heir. Her pride was being restored, polished to a perfect, agonizing sheen. It's strange, isn't it? When we are most vulnerable, We often find our greatest strength in the very things that define us, even if those things are flaws. Eleanor's pride might be toxic, but in this world, it is her shield. What flaw have you turned into your weapon? Eleanor stood outside, breathing in the crisp, freezing air of the Pacific morning. The garden was silent. The elaborate wedding arch, meant for the ceremony, now dismantled and stacked in the corner of the lawn, a poignant monument to the destruction. She heard the gardener's whirring electric shears in the distance, a futile attempt to impose order on a chaotic weekend. Despite the social triumph, the small, quiet voice of the reversion, that Charlotte's actions were born of pain, not pure malice, gnawed at the edges of Eleanor's conscience. If she was truly victorious, why did the diamond bracelet on her wrist, a wedding gift from Robert's family, feel like a handcuff? She pushed the thought down. Growth required recognizing the pattern, but her pride ensured she interpreted the pattern only as justification for the severity of her response. Charlotte needed to learn respect for the structure she depended upon. Eleanor's phone buzzed. It was Douglas. The papers were finalized. Charlotte had been served notice. Douglas confirmed that Charlotte's personal accounts outside the trust were minimal. She was completely dependent on Eleanor. 30 hours and 45 minutes remain until the Sunday edition hits the stands. Eleanor had won the battle for public opinion and legal control, but Charlotte was quiet. Too quiet. This silence was the precursor to the final, necessary confrontation. Obstaculo 3, a crise maxima, 75%, perda total causada pela falha. Saturday night arrived, heavy and cold. The house felt like a mausoleum, echoing with the silence of the uncelebrated wedding. Eleanor hadn't seen Charlotte since the confrontation, but she knew her daughter was still on the property. Eleanor's unyielding pride demanded the final personal capitulation. Charlotte had to beg for forgiveness publicly and acknowledge Eleanor's absolute authority. Until then, the financial hammer remained poised. At 10 p.m., Eleanor walked to the guest house. The air was still, only the distant, mournful sound of a foghorn breaking the oppressive quiet. She found the door unlocked. Inside, the small living room was pristine, unnervingly neat. But as she stepped toward the bedroom, she noticed something odd. Charlotte's enormous steamer trunk, packed for the honeymoon, was gone. Eleanor stepped into the bedroom. The absence of the trunk sent a spike of pure, cold fear into her chest. On the dresser sat a small, folded envelope bearing the Vance crest. Eleanor snatched it up. The paper felt heavy, thick, a texture that screamed permanence. The note was short, written in Charlotte's elegant, pointed script. Mother, you wanted control. You wanted to prove that my existence was contingent upon your approval, and that your reputation was more valuable than your family. I grant you your victory. Keep the money, keep the house, keep your precious social narrative. You have won the Vance legacy, but you have lost the only thing you could never buy or control, me. I am leaving this life. The shame of being your daughter and the failure of trying to earn your love is a burden too heavy to carry. Thank you for showing me exactly what I am worth to you. The moment you realize your victory is hollow is perhaps the most dangerous time. That crushing realization that the cost was too high, that you destroyed the very thing you claimed to protect. Have you ever regretted a win that cost you everything? The world tilted. Eleanor's hands started to shake uncontrollably, causing the heavy paper to rustle like dry leaves. This was not the capitulation her pride had anticipated. This was total annihilation. Charlotte had not just left the property, she had threatened to leave life itself. Eleanor's pride, demanding such extreme punitive action, had caused this terminal loss. This final, irreversible crisis was entirely her doing. Eleanor stumbled backward, the polished wooden floor suddenly slick beneath her feet. She grabbed her phone, her fingers fumbling against the screen. 18 hours remain. Until the news breaks, but that felt secondary. She needed to call the police, but the sheer scandal of involving law enforcement would destroy the last vestiges of her controlled narrative. Her pride hesitated, even now, balancing her daughter's life against the loss of her perfect reputation. The police meant public exposure, humiliation, and questions. But Charlotte's life was at stake. She made the call. She barked the address into the receiver, the sound of her own voice ragged and unrecognizable. The immediate deafening silence in the room was broken only by the chattering of her own teeth. A noite escura da alma, mudanza interna obligatoria. The next 3 hours were a blur of flashing blue lights and the cold, assessing eyes of the local police chief. Eleanor, stripped of her composure, paced the mahogany floors of her foyer. the expensive rugs providing no comfort against the deep chill that had set in her bones. She repeated Charlotte's note to the officers, omitting the crucial context of the trust revocation, clinging instinctively to the remaining shreds of her reputation. Yet, her focus had fractured. The rigid wall of unyielding pride had developed a hairline crack under the weight of sheer maternal terror. For the first time, the loss of her daughter felt exponentially more catastrophic than the loss of social standing. The police were systematic, efficient, and ultimately useless. They established Charlotte hadn't left by car and had only a short lead. They theorized she had gone to the nearest point of deep water, the cliff path overlooking the Sound. When tragedy strikes, the carefully constructed self often collapses. Have you ever faced a moment where the rules you lived by suddenly became meaningless? What did you discover about yourself in that panic? Eleanor stood frozen in the entranceway, watching the police lights paint the glass walls with frantic streaks of color. She looked at her reflection, the perfect armor of her suit, the immaculate hair, the expression of a woman who had just realized she had traded her flesh and blood for an empty title. The sterile smell of police rubber gloves and the constant low static of the radios were the sounds of her world ending. She had to find her. The police were focused on protocol. Eleanor knew her daughter's heart. She suddenly recalled a conversation from years ago during a sailing trip, a conversation Charlotte had shared about a hidden cave along the coastline, accessible only at low tide, where she used to go to escape the noise of the house. It was a secret, a childhood vulnerability Charlotte had only shared with her mother, a secret Eleanor's pride had deemed irrelevant until this exact terrifying moment. Eleanor grabbed a heavy wool coat and rushed out. 15 hours remain, until the inevitable public catastrophe, but the clock was running out on Charlotte's life. She drove the massive SUV down the winding, fog-draped cliff road, the tires crunching on the wet gravel. Her internal change was absolute. The pursuit of vengeance was replaced by the desperate, raw need for salvation. Her pride was momentarily silenced, replaced by a devastating reckoning. She had chosen power over love, and the universe was demanding payment. Climax: no limite exacto du prazo. Eleanor parked the SUV haphazardly near the overgrown path that led down the cliff face. The tide was low, exactly as Charlotte had specified years ago. The descent was treacherous, the path wet with dew and slick with moss. Eleanor, in her expensive leather boots, slipped several times, catching herself on the jagged, cold texture of the wet rock. Her tailored suit snagged on thorny bushes, tearing the fabric. She ignored the pain, driven only by the visceral panic squeezing her chest. She reached the bottom, her lungs burning, the powerful, salty smell of the ocean overwhelming her senses. The beach was narrow, littered with driftwood. She saw the dark, gaping maw of the small cave entrance, exactly where Charlotte said it would be. "Charlotte!" Eleanor screamed, her voice hoarse, swallowed immediately by the roaring, insistent crash of the incoming waves. She stumbled inside. The air was damp and still, heavy with the scent of wet stone and decay, and there she was. Charlotte sat curled on a flattened rock, her wedding dress, the gown that represented the life Eleanor had just snatched away, torn and soiled, clinging to her. Next to her was the empty glass vial that had held her sleeping pills. There is no sound more terrifying than the silence of a life hanging in the balance. In that moment of absolute crisis, you stop being the person the world knows and become only the core, essential self. What do you think you would discover about yourself in that moment? Eleanor rushed forward, her knees hitting the wet sand. She reached for her daughter, the cold, wet fabric of Charlotte's dress, rough and sodden, beneath her shaking hand. "Charlotte! No! Wake up!" Charlotte stirred slightly, her eyelids fluttering open. Her eyes, usually so sharp with resentment, were glazed and unfocused. "You came," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the increasing volume of the ocean. "I knew you would choose the pride. I just wanted an ending." Eleanor pulled her daughter into a desperate embrace, ignoring the sand and the water. "No," Eleanor choked out, the word tasting like ash. "No, Charlotte, I chose you. I chose you." Eleanor had abandoned the narrative, abandoned the facade, abandoned the fear of public scandal. Her only focus was the trembling life in her arms. She checked her phone. The clock was ticking towards dawn. Less than 12 hours remain. She had to get her daughter to the hospital now, before the pills fully took effect and before the sun rose to illuminate the catastrophic wreckage of their lives. Reversone 2 and Resolution, Revelação Final Imprevisível. Eleanor managed to drag Charlotte out of the cave just as the first sliver of gray light touched the horizon. The climb was agonizing, fueled by adrenaline and terror. She got Charlotte to the hospital triage, screaming for help, collapsing only when the nurses swiftly wheeled her daughter away. The next few hours were spent in the antiseptic chill of the waiting room. Douglas arrived, having been contacted by the police. He sat, rigid and horrified, holding the freshly printed Sunday edition of the paper, the headline screaming of Eleanor's noble sacrifice regarding the foundation. The timing was disastrously perfect. The world believed Eleanor was a saint protecting her wealth. In reality, she was a desperate mother facing the consequences of her cruelty. Charlotte stabilized. Eleanor was allowed to see her as the morning progressed. Charlotte lay pale in the sterile bed, the IV drip a tiny rhythmic sound in the silence. "Why?" Eleanor whispered, her voice still raw from screaming. "Why the note? Why try this?" Charlotte turned her head slowly, her eyes finding Eleanor's. Her lips curved into a faint, chilling smile. Reversion 2, 85%. "I didn't take the pills, Mother," Charlotte whispered, the words clear, deliberate, and devastatingly calculated. "They were over-the-counter painkillers. I wanted you to think I did. The trunk is in the yacht club locker, and I arranged for a flight to Paris this afternoon. I knew that the only thing more powerful than your pride was the fear of losing your daughter publicly, forever, to something you caused. You had to choose between your reputation and your sanity, right then and there." Eleanor stared, the blood draining from her face. Her own internal collapse in the cave, her genuine, agonizing moment of choosing Charlotte over her reputation, had been based on a brilliant, cold-blooded lie. Charlotte hadn't been aiming for attention. She had been aiming for Eleanor's soul, forcing her mother to destroy the pride she cherished most by making her sacrifice the narrative to the police. Imagine the horror of realizing the one moment you felt true. Authentic grief was a calculated performance designed specifically for you. Does that kind of betrayal truly destroy love, or just transform it into something toxic? Think about that. You orchestrated this? Eleanor's hand tightened into a fist, crushing the hospital gown she held. You stripped me of my future, my fiancé, and my dignity in front of the entire city to satisfy your ego, Charlotte continued, devoid of pity. I stripped you of your control and your flawless public image by forcing you to choose my life over your precious secret. The police know you found a suicide note. The doctors know you brought me in after a suspected attempt. Cassandra Hayes will know by lunchtime. You might have the trust, but I have the real power now, Mother. You are a victim of your own toxic pride. Eleanor stood defeated, the finality of Charlotte's victory settling over her like grave dirt. The ultimate irony was that in attempting to save her reputation by finding Charlotte, she had utterly destroyed it, forcing the very public scandal she desperately sought to avoid. Conclusão com custo. Vitória plus. Perda permanente. Balanço agridoce. The immediate consequences were swift and brutal. Eleanor had, technically, achieved her objective. She retained full control of the Vance Trust, financially bankrupting her daughter and securing her reputation as a formidable business strategist, as per Cassandra's column. This was the victory. However, the cost was immeasurable. The public revelation of the suicide threat, real or manufactured, provided the community with a far juicier scandal than mere financial restructuring. The stinging, sharp smell of disinfectant in the hospital corridor became the permanent scent of Eleanor's new reality. By 1 p.m., the news of Charlotte's crisis had eclipsed the wedding cancellation. The whispers weren't about Eleanor's competence, but about her cruelty. Her name was now synonymous with the phrase toxic matriarch. Eleanor walked out of the hospital, leaving Charlotte to finalize her flight arrangements. She didn't look back. The police chief intercepted her at the entrance, his face grave. We'll be requesting an official statement soon, Mrs. Vance. We need to close the file on this incident. She drove home alone, the massive estate now feeling colder and more vast than ever. The final act of the saga occurred 3 days later. Eleanor received a final formal letter from Charlotte, postmarked from Paris. It wasn't accusatory. It was simply a legal notice severing all formal ties, rejecting any future possibility of reinstatement in the trust, and a request for the forwarding of some final personal effects. The letter confirmed the permanent loss, the total, absolute destruction of the mother-daughter relationship. Charlotte had traded material wealth for emotional freedom, and in doing so had won the final psychological battle. Eleanor was left with the Vance legacy, immaculate and untouched, but utterly alone, consumed by the consequence of her unyielding pride. She had preserved the structure, but emptied the contents. The victory was ashes in her mouth. Eleanor stood in the ballroom 3 days after the canceled wedding, the spot where Charlotte had delivered the initial blow. The chandeliers sparkled, but the light was cold. She ran her fingers across the cool, polished marble of the floor. She had demanded respect, and in her prideful pursuit, she had earned only fear and isolation. She picked up a stray, discarded wedding favor, a small silver charm, and crushed it in her palm, the metal edges digging a painful, visible mark into her skin. The physical pain was a paltry distraction from the true wound. We often think that winning means having the last word, the most money, or the highest status. But sometimes true defeat is winning at the cost of your own soul. If you reach the end of this story, you know the price of unchecked pride. What is the one thing you would never trade for a hollow victory?